Okay, we are back, and I found the reference I was looking for. So it is in, the reference is in uh, 2 Samuel 21, verse 1. Now, this is years later because we know Joshua made this agreement with the Gibeonites. And then, of course, he and that generation died. Then there were judges that ruled the land for many years. And then after that, they wanted a king. So finally, Saul became the first king. And then now David is the second king. So many years have passed since Joshua made this covenant with the Gibeonites. Now, when Saul was king, we don't have record of it in the Bible, but other than what's mentioned right here. But this is later than when David, later on in the days of David as king. In verse 1 there, chapter 21 of 2 Samuel, there was a famine in the days of David for 3 consecutive years. So David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered, "It is because of Saul and because of his bloody house, because he slew the Gibeonites, killed the Gibeonites." And the king called the Gibeonites and said to them, now the Gibeonites were not of the sons of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Remember, they're in the land of Canaan. And the sons of Israel had sworn to them, and Saul had sought to kill them in his zeal for the sons of Israel and Judah. So he disregarded the covenant that they had. He wanted to wipe them out. Therefore, David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? And with what shall I make reconciliation that you may bless the inheritance of the Lord?" Because right now they were experiencing a curse. And the Gibeonites replied unto him, "We have no quarrel regarding silver or gold with Saul nor his house, neither do we desire that anyone in Israel should die." So David said then, what you say, I will do for you. And they answered the king, "The man that consumed us and that devised against us, let us destroy him nothing of him remains in any of the borders of Israel. Let 7 men of his sons be delivered unto us, and we will disjoint them, hanging them from a tree unto the Lord in Gibeah of Saul, whom the Lord did choose." And the king, David, said, "I will give them." Now, note this, that this was not God's requirement. This was their requirement. They were not Israelites. They were still, we don't know if they're worshiping the God of Israel or not. They were definitely living under protection in Israel. But they required that 7 men of Saul's sons would be killed as a payment for all the bloodshed that Saul had brought against them when he violated the covenant. So they answered the king that way, and David said, "Okay, I will give them." But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. Now, this is another covenant story that we're going to look at between David and Jonathan. That's why David had a covenant with Jonathan, so he was going to spare one of Jonathan's sons because of his covenant with Jonathan. But he was going to have 7 of other Saul's sons put to death because Saul had violated the covenant with the Gibeonites. So this is all very interesting. But the king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and who she gave birth to Saul, and names them there, and 5 sons of Michal, the daughter of Saul, whom she had given birth to, and names them there. He delivered them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they hung them up from a tree in the hill before the Lord. And they fell, all 7 were put to death in the days of harvest, in the first days in the beginning of the barley harvest. That's really the time of Passover. Because the Passover is around the time of the beginning of the barley harvest. That is called the first fruits. The festival of the first fruits is the barley harvest. It comes right after Passover. So that's interesting. So anyway, he put him to death, hung him there, and then one of the wives of the one that was killed, stayed there with the bodies for months until David finally took the bones and all the bones of Saul and Jonathan, and put them all together in a grave and buried them in a place where all this, the family of Saul could be buried in one place. So, and look at the very last verse, part of verse 14. They buried the bones of Saul and Jonathan in the land of Benjamin and Zelah, in the grave of Kish's father, and they performed all the king commanded. So they took the bones of Jonathan and Saul from the earlier days, and all these 7 men that they were killed from his family, and buried them in the grave of his father, Saul's father, in the land of Benjamin. After that, God was entreated for the land. In other words, he lifted the curse of the famine. All because Joshua entered in the covenant, and they were obligated to protect them. That's why they went out and fought those other kings, and God fought for them and delivered them. And now, when Saul got in there, he thought he was going to do God a favor. Of course, if you read the life of Saul, he had a way of not doing exactly what he was supposed to do. And so he thought he would do God a favor and kill these people because they were Amorites. And yet Israel had made a covenant with them. So because later, which is another interesting thought, that this famine showed up years later after Saul was dead and after David had been king, this famine hits. And it was because of something that happened back under Saul's day. But once the wrong was made right, the famine lifted and the blessing of God was restored to the land. So that's an interesting story of covenant, but it shows you the power of a covenant, the power of agreement, the power of committing yourself to each other, and that the bond that is there is it's very sacred, very honorable, and very I wouldn't say unbreakable, but you can see that men have broken it, like Saul, and it caused severe consequences. But covenant is a very powerful thing. So now we'll talk about Mephibosheth and Jonathan in a little bit here. Before we do that, though, there's one more covenant that I want to show you that took place between two men in the Old Testament, and that is between Jacob, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, and his father-in-law, Laban. Now, this is in Genesis chapter 31. And to give you a little background on the situation here is, Jacob, him and his brother Esau got into competition with one another. Jacob stole his birthright and then got his blessing when the father was dying. And Esau swore that he was going to kill him. So Jacob flees from the land of Canaan up to Syria, where Abraham lived before he went into Israel, to the land of Canaan. And so Jacob flees up there. He ends up marrying two of Laban's daughters, Rachel and Leah. Of course, that if you're familiar with the story, he loved Rachel because she was beautiful and they loved each other. But Laban did a dirty trick. He switched, and he didn't want to give the older daughter in marriage he didn't want to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. So he put Leah in the tent at night in the dark, of course, when they were married, and of course they're veiled, so he didn't know who he was actually marrying. So he ends up with Leah, and then he had to work 7 years to get Rachel. That turns out to be Leah. So then he has to stay there, promise to work another 7 years, and gives Rachel to him. So now he's got two wives. And then as time goes on, he's working with Laban's flocks, and Laban is mistreating him. And it's time for Jacob to take all of his family and his kids and his sheep, goats, and whatever he's got, and go back to the land of Abraham and Isaac. So we start here in chapter 31. Jacob beheld, verse 2, Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not like it was before. There was attitudes and things beginning to develop. There was tension, there was strife, and Laban's sons were getting jealous of Jacob because God was prospering Jacob in the midst of all this, being mistreated. So, but Jacob decided, he's going to split. He's going to take his wives, kids, and flocks and get out of there and go back to where the land of his forefathers. And so the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers, to your relatives, and I will be with you. And Jacob called Rachel and Leah to the field to where he was out with the flocks. He called them out there to talk to them. He said, I see that your father's countenance towards me is changed. But God has been with me. The God of my father has been with me. And you know that all my power I have served your father, and your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not allow him to hurt me. And so he goes on and talks about how he's telling his wife, how God had prospered him in spite of what their father was trying to do. So then he says in verse 11, and the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob, and he told him that this angel gave him divine instructions on how to prosper and even under the hand of Laban. Then the angel tells him, I'm the God of Bethel, where you anointed the pillar, where you vowed a vow to me. Now rise, get out from this land, and return to the land of your family. Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there any reason for us to stay here? You know, there's nothing left for us here. Are we not counted like strangers by our own father? He sold us and devoured all our money. So anyway, the long story short, packs up the family, the tents, the cattle, the sheep and all that. They rose up and they left. And they were about, it says, now Rachel, in the meantime, she did something. She stole her father's idols, which that's a whole nother story that comes into this down the road. But anyway, so they fled. They passed over the river. They went towards Mount Gilead. And it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, had run away. So Laban took his brothers with him and pursued after him for 7 days' journey. And they finally caught up to him at Mount Gilead. God came to Laban, the Syrian, in a dream by night and said, you better be careful what you say to Jacob. You better not say anything good or bad, because God's warning them. He's protecting him. Laban overtook Jacob, and Jacob had pitched a tent in the mountain, and Laban pitched in the mountain also, their tents. And then Laban came to Jacob and said, what have you done? You have stolen away unawares and carried away my daughters as captives with the sword. Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and did not tell me, that I might have sent you away with joy, songs, and a party? Yeah, like that would have happened, right? And so anyway, so they go through this thing. Jacob answers and said, how you mistreated me, so forth and so on. So now we go down to the end of this meeting here. And after Laban is complaining and so forth and so on. But then Laban says, okay, now come, verse 44, let's make a covenant, you and me, and let it be for a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up for a pillar. There's that memorial. And Jacob said to his brothers, gather stones, and they made a great heap of stones as a memorial for this covenant. And Laban called it one name, Jacob called it Gilead. And Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me. Therefore, the name it was called Gilead. And Mizpah also was called. And he said, the Lord will watch between me and you while we are absent from one another. If you hurt my daughters, or if you shall take any other wives besides my daughters, God will see it. He's a witness. And Laban said to Jacob, behold this heap, behold this pillar which I've cast between you and me. This heap is a witness, this pillar is a witness that I will not pass over this heap to hurt you, and you'll not pass over this heap to hurt me. And the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judged between us. And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, meaning God. Jacob offered sacrifice, so there's the blood being shed. And he called his brother to eat, so there's the meal. And they ate bread and tarried all night in the mountain. And in the morning, Laban rose up, kissed his sons and daughters, and he went back home. And then Jacob left on his way. But they made a covenant that they would not harm each other's family, and they set up a witness. They had a sacrifice, they had a meal, they had vows exchanged, they had a sacrifice, the blood was shed. And so they they created this covenant that the sons of Laban would not afflict the sons of Israel and vice versa. And, actually today that covenant is being broken because the sons of Laban were the descendants of what is now the Syrians in that area. So I think that's interesting too, that there's a conflict there today, that because an ancient covenant is not being adhered to. So again, this is one of the stories in the Bible that we can see these evidence of covenant. So we've looked at marriage, we've looked at Jacob and Laban, we've looked at the Gibeonites with Joshua and later with David and how that all worked out. And so now I want to, on our next lesson when we come back, we're going to start talking about this covenant between David and Jonathan and how it affected Mephibosheth years later. And that's an amazing story also. So until next time, we will sign off now and look forward to taking up right here as we continue our journey on blood covenant. So until next time, God bless you.